The moment the officer stepped out of his patrol car, he knew this was going to be one of those stops. The kind that made his blood boil. The black luxury car had rolled through a stop sign, just slightly, but that was enough. The driver, well-dressed, confident, barely glanced in his rearview mirror as the flashing red and blue lights filled the street. He pulled over calmly, too calmly, like he had nothing to fear. That annoyed the officer. He squared his shoulders, adjusting his belt as he approached the driver's side. The moment the window slid down, he saw the man's face, calm, composed, with eyes that seemed to see through him. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice sharp. The man didn't flinch. "Is there a problem, officer?" That tone. That unshaken confidence. That look. It made the officer's skin prickle. "Yeah, you rolled through a stop sign," he snapped. "License and registration. Now." The man moved slowly, reaching into his glove compartment. A movement so careful, so measured, it set the officer's nerves on edge. "Move faster," the officer barked. "Or do I need to take you out of the car?" People on the sidewalk had begun to stop. Eyes watched. Phones were out. Recording. Still, the man didn't react. He handed over his license with the same eerie calm. The officer barely glanced at it before tossing it back. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered. The man sighed, his shoulders lifting as if he already knew how this would play out. But he obeyed. As soon as he was standing, the officer pressed him against the car, roughly patting him down. Checking for weapons. Checking for excuses. Nothing. The officer stepped back, glaring. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The man gave a small smile, shaking his head. "I believe that's none of your concern." That made the officer's blood run hot. "None of my concern?" He let out a sharp laugh. "I pull over a guy like you, in a car like this, and you think I shouldn't be concerned?" The crowd around them was growing. Murmurs. Disapproving looks. The officer felt the shift in energy, but his anger burned brighter. "Hands behind your back. Am I under arrest?" The man's voice was still steady, but there was a shift in his eyes. A warning. The officer ignored it. "When I tell you to put your hands behind your back, you do it." The man exhaled slowly. Then, he complied. The officer reached for his cuffs, satisfaction curling in his chest. He had control now. He was in charge. And then, "Excuse me." A woman's voice. Sharp. Urgent. The officer barely had time to react before someone pushed through the crowd, a woman in a blazer, looking furious. "Do you even know who this is?" she demanded. The officer blinked, thrown off. He glanced at the man he was about to cuff. His face was unreadable. The woman turned to the crowd, lifting her phone. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching a police officer arrest a federal judge." A beat of silence. Then, the shift. The officer's stomach dropped. He looked at the man again, really looked at him. And now, he saw it. The calm wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. It was the confidence of someone who had already won. The crowd gasped. Whispers turned into sharp, hushed words. "He's a judge? Oh, this guy's done. This is bad, real bad." The officer's grip on the cuffs loosened. The judge turned his head slightly, eyes meeting the officer's. And for the first time since the stop began, he smiled. Not in anger. Not in fear. But in a way that said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." To be continued. This sets up the strong hook, mystery, suspense, and a dramatic moment that forces the audience to ask, what happens next? The cop has no idea what's coming, but the audience does, and they're hooked. The officer sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. His uniform felt tighter than usual, the air in the room heavier. He had been here before, but never like this. Today, he wasn't standing as an officer. He was sitting as the accused. His mind was still spinning from that moment on the street. The way the judge had looked at him, not with anger, not even with amusement, but with something much worse. Knowing. The door at the front of the courtroom opened. The sound of polished shoes on marble floors echoed through the silent room. The officer looked up. And there he was. The judge. The same man he had shoved against the car, the same man he had tried to cuff. But now, he wasn't on the street. He was on the bench, in his robe, with the power of the law behind him. The officer swallowed hard. The judge took his seat, adjusting his robe with slow, precise movements. He glanced at the papers in front of him before lifting his gaze. Directly at the officer. Something about that look made the officer's stomach twist. The power dynamic had shifted. Before, on the street, the officer had been the one holding control. The one giving orders. The one deciding what happened next. But now? Now, he was at the judge's mercy. The room was completely silent. Not even a cough, not even the shuffle of a chair. Then, the judge finally spoke. His voice was calm. Controlled. But there was something underneath it. Something the officer couldn't quite place. State your name for the record. The officer's mouth felt dry. He forced himself to answer. He barely recognized his own voice. The judge nodded, glancing down at the papers. Officer, do you know why you're here today? The officer's jaw tensed. He knew. But saying it out loud? That was different. Still, he had no choice. For my conduct during a traffic stop, Your Honor. The judge tilted his head slightly. Your conduct? The officer shifted in his chair. He could feel eyes on him. The courtroom was filled with people. Other officers. Lawyers. Reporters. They were all waiting. Watching. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. Tell me, officer. Would you like to describe what happened that day? The officer felt his pulse quicken. His tongue darted out, wetting his lips. I stopped a vehicle, he started. The driver failed to come to a complete stop at an intersection. The judge didn't react. He just watched him. Waiting. The officer cleared his throat. During the stop, I asked for identification. I, then requested the driver to exit the vehicle. Still, the judge said nothing. The silence stretched. The officer swallowed. He knew what the judge was waiting for. The part where he had humiliated him. The part where he had assumed. The part where he had abused his power. The officer shifted. The words wouldn't come. And then, the judge tilted his head slightly. Tell me, officer, he said. At what point did you realize who I was? The officer's breath caught. There it was. The question. The one that mattered most. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? If the officer had known, if he had recognized the judge that day, he never would have treated him that way. He would have been polite. Respectful. Careful. But that's the problem, isn't it? It shouldn't take a title to deserve respect. And now, he was sitting here, facing the consequences of that mistake. The judge didn't break eye contact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment was heavy enough. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge leaned back. Very well. He picked up his gavel. The officer braced himself. And then, the judge didn't rule. Instead, he said something that left the officer completely stunned. I am not here to punish you. I am here to test you. The officer's heart pounded. What the hell did that mean? Before he could ask, the judge continued. You will not be suspended. You will not be fired. But your actions demand accountability. The judge's gaze was sharp. You will spend the next 6 months working in community service. Not as an officer, but as a civilian. A hush fell over the courtroom. The officer blinked. He had expected the worst. But this? He couldn't tell if it was worse, or better. The judge closed his file. Dismissed. And just like that, it was over. The officer stood, his body stiff, his mind racing. As he turned to leave, he glanced back. The judge was still there. Watching. Not with anger. Not with vengeance. But with something else. Something that unsettled the officer more than anything. Expectation. As if this wasn't the end. As if this was just the beginning. To be continued. This sets up the major conflict and power shift, keeping the suspense high. The officer expected punishment, but instead, he's been given a test. A challenge. And he has no idea how it will change him. The officer sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. His uniform felt tighter than usual, the air in the room heavier. He had been here before, but never like this. Today, he wasn't standing as an officer. He was sitting as the accused. His mind was still spinning from that moment on the street. The way the judge had looked at him, not with anger, not even with amusement, but with something much worse. Knowing. The door at the front of the courtroom opened. The sound of polished shoes on marble floors echoed through the silent room. The officer looked up. And there he was. The judge. The same man he had humiliated, pushed against the car, and nearly arrested for nothing. He was dressed in black robes now, his posture tall, his expression unreadable. The officer swallowed hard. He had been in front of judges before, but never one who had a reason to hate him. The judge took his seat. For a moment, there was silence. Then, he spoke. Officer, state your name. The cop sat up straight. His voice wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. Officer Daniel Harris, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Officer Harris, do you know why you are here? He did. But he hesitated. I'm here because of a misunderstanding, he said finally. The judge tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. A misunderstanding? The courtroom was filled with people. Other officers, reporters, community members. And yet, in that moment, it felt like only two people existed in the room, the cop and the judge. The judge reached to the side of his bench and picked up a folder. He flipped it open, his fingers moving across the pages. Let's review the facts, he said. The officer's jaw tightened. He could feel sweat gathering at the base of his neck. You pulled over a man who had committed no crime, handled him roughly, and attempted to place him in handcuffs without cause. The judge looked up. Is that accurate? The officer shifted in his seat. He rolled through a stop sign, he said. And he acted suspiciously. The judge raised an eyebrow. Suspiciously? The officer felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. He suddenly wished he were anywhere else. He didn't seem nervous, he muttered. Most people get nervous when they're stopped by police. The judge closed the folder. He leaned back in his chair, watching the officer with an expression that was hard to read. So let me get this straight, he said. Because I was calm, you assumed I was guilty? The officer didn't answer. The judge exhaled, then turned to the side, where a television screen was set up. Let's take a look at the footage, he said. The screen flickered to life. The officer watched as the video played, his own voice, his own actions, clear as day. The way he had barked orders. The way he had grabbed the judge's arm. The way the crowd had murmured, unsettled. Then came the moment when the woman's voice cut through the chaos. "Do you even know who this is?" The judge let the video play out in full silence. When it ended, he turned back to the officer. "Is there anything you'd like to say, Officer Harris?" The officer's mouth felt dry. He looked at the faces in the room, some expectant, some judging. But the worst part was the way the judge was looking at him. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with disappointment. Somehow, that was worse. He exhaled, shifting in his seat. I was just doing my job." The judge tapped his fingers on the bench. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Officer Harris, have you ever been judged unfairly?" The question caught him off guard. The officer hesitated. What do you mean?" The judge's eyes didn't waver. "I mean, have you ever had someone look at you and decide who you are before you even opened your mouth?" Silence. The officer swallowed hard. The judge continued. "Have you ever been spoken to like you were less than a person? Treated as if you were guilty just because of how you look?" The officer looked down. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say something to defend himself. But the truth was, he had no defense. Because deep down, he knew the judge was right. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the judge's next words seemed to echo louder. "Officer Harris, the law is meant to protect everyone. Not just the people you feel comfortable around." The officer clenched his jaw. The judge studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I have the authority to punish you severely for what you did. I could end your career today. And part of me thinks you deserve that." The officer's breath caught in his throat. But then, the judge did something unexpected. He smiled. A small, knowing smile. "But I have something better in mind." The officer frowned. What do you mean?" The judge closed the folder and placed it to the side. "You'll find out soon enough." And just like that, he banged the gavel. Court adjourned. The officer remained frozen in his seat. The courtroom emptied, but Officer Harris remained in his seat, staring at the judge's bench. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. "You'll find out soon enough." Those words haunted him. He had expected the worst. A suspension, a fine, maybe even termination. But what did the judge mean? Why had he smiled? A bailiff cleared his throat. "Officer Harris, time to go." Harris stood stiffly, adjusting his uniform. He felt the weight of dozens of stairs as he walked toward the exit. Reporters were already outside, cameras flashing. He pushed through them, ignoring the voices shouting his name. But before he could reach his patrol car, someone called out. "Officer Harris." He froze. That voice. He turned slowly. The judge stood near the courthouse steps, hands clasped behind his back. Waiting for him. Harris's jaw tightened. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to walk away. But he knew he couldn't. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The judge studied him in silence. Finally, he spoke. "You assume a lot of things, Officer Harris." Harris frowned. "Excuse me?" "You assumed I was guilty before you knew me. You assumed I would punish you today." The judge paused. "And you assume you understand justice." Harris straightened. "I enforce the law." The judge's lips curled slightly. Enforcement isn't the same as justice. Silence stretched between them. Harris didn't know what to say. The judge's voice was steady, not angry, not vengeful. Just certain. "What are you going to do to me?" Harris finally asked. The judge smiled again. Nothing. That caught Harris off guard. Nothing? The judge nodded. I'm not your enemy, officer. I'm your teacher. Harris stiffened. I don't need a lesson. The judge's eyes darkened slightly. Oh, but you do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Here. Read this. Harris hesitated before taking it. He unfolded the page, his eyes scanning the words. His stomach dropped. Community service? He looked up in disbelief. You want me to, yes. Harris could barely believe it. He expected a punishment, a suspension, desk duty, maybe even losing his badge. But this? The judge continued, his voice firm. For the next month, you'll serve in the very community you patrol. You will listen. You will learn. And when it's over, we'll see if you still view the world the same way. Harris clenched his fists. I don't need to do this. The judge's expression didn't change. No. But you should. For the first time, Harris felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not shame. But fear. Because deep down, he knew the judge was right. And that terrified him more than anything. Officer Harris sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The crumpled piece of paper, the judge's punishment, lay on the seat beside him. Community service. He still couldn't believe it. He had walked into that courtroom expecting a battle, expecting anger, expecting punishment. Instead, the judge had handed him something worse. A chance to change. Harris exhaled, shaking his head. This was a joke. What was he supposed to learn from working in a neighborhood that hated him? His radio crackled, but he ignored it. He didn't need backup for what he was about to do. He picked up the paper again, scanning the address. It led him to a small community center in a part of the city he had only ever driven through, never stopped. Never walked. The center was old but well maintained. The walls were covered in murals of black historical figures. Harris recognized some, but not all. That fact made his stomach twist slightly. He stepped inside. A woman at the front desk looked up. Her eyes flicked to his uniform, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't trust him. He understood why. I'm here for. He hesitated, then forced himself to finish. Community service. The woman gave him a long, careful look before nodding. She reached for a clipboard. Sign in. Someone will be with you soon. Harris scrawled his name, his fingers gripping the pen harder than necessary. He was barely done when a deep voice spoke behind him. So. You're the cop. Harris turned. A tall, elderly man stood before him. His dark skin was weathered with age, but his eyes were sharp, piercing. He leaned on a cane, but there was no weakness in his stance. The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. Come with me. Harris followed, unsure why he suddenly felt nervous. The man led him down a hallway lined with old photographs. Kids playing. Families. Events from decades ago. Harris saw glimpses of history in the pictures. Struggles, victories, moments frozen in time. They entered a small office. The man gestured for Harris to sit. Harris remained standing. The man chuckled. Suit yourself. He lowered himself into a chair, resting both hands on his cane. You know who I am? The man asked. Harris shook his head. Didn't think so. The man exhaled, tapping his cane against the floor. I used to be a cop. Long time ago. Back when the badge didn't mean protection for people like me. Harris stiffened. Didn't think so. The man exhaled, tapping his cane against the floor. I used to be a cop. Long time ago. Back when the badge didn't mean protection for people like me. Harris stiffened. You think I don't understand what it's like to wear that uniform? The man continued. I do. I know what it means to carry that weight. To feel like you're in charge, like the city belongs to you. His voice softened. But I also know what it's like to be on the other side of it. Harris frowned. What are you saying? The man leaned forward slightly. I'm saying I know men like you. Men like me? Harris's voice hardened. The man nodded. Men who wear the badge for the wrong reasons. Harris's hands curled into fists. I'm not a bad cop. The man didn't look away. Then prove it. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the man stood, moving toward the door. Your shift starts now. Harris hesitated. Doing what? The man smirked. Listening. Harris exhaled sharply but followed. Whatever lesson the judge wanted him to learn, it started now. Officer Harris followed the old man through the community center, his boots echoing on the worn wooden floors. The air smelled of books, coffee, and something else, history. The walls were covered in faded newspaper clippings, photographs of protests, and framed letters signed by leaders Harris had only read about in school. It felt like he had stepped into a different world. The old man, who still hadn't told him his name, led him into a small room. Inside, a few young men sat in a circle, their faces wary when they saw Harris. Have a seat, officer, the old man said. Harris hesitated but sat down. He could feel every pair of eyes on him. Finally, one of the young men, a tall guy with a scar on his cheek, spoke. What's a cop doing here? Harris folded his arms. Community service. The scarred man scoffed. Let me guess. You roughed someone up? Got caught on video? Now they're making you understand the community? Laughter rippled through the group. Harris clenched his jaw. The old man held up a hand, silencing them. Tell me, officer, what do you see when you look at these young men? Harris blinked. What do you mean? The old man's eyes narrowed. When you pull someone over, what's the first thing that crosses your mind? Harris shifted in his seat. I look for threats. Suspicious behavior. Suspicious? One of the young men leaned forward. Like what? Hoodies? Loud music? Skin color? The tension in the room thickened. Harris exhaled. That's not what I meant. But that's what you do, the scarred man said. You see someone like me and assume we're a problem. Harris didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew they were right. The old man tapped his cane. Let me tell you a story, officer. Harris glanced at him. I was 16 the first time I got stopped by the police, the old man said. I was walking home. Didn't do anything wrong. But a cop pulled up, told me to put my hands on the car, searched me. His voice darkened. You know what he said after? Next time, don't look so guilty. Silence filled the room. The old man's gaze locked onto Harris. Do you know what that moment taught me? Harris swallowed. What? That the law wasn't built for me. His words hit like a punch to the gut. The old man leaned forward. You've been a cop for years, Harris. Have you ever thought about how it feels to be on the other side of the badge? Harris didn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he did. And he didn't like what he saw. The silence in the room was thick. Harris felt every stare like a weight pressing down on him. He had been in hostile situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about control. This was about truth. The old man finally spoke. You look uncomfortable, officer. Harris exhaled sharply. I didn't come here to be lectured. Then why are you here? The old man's voice was calm, steady. Harris hesitated. He wanted to say because I was ordered to. But the words felt wrong. Instead, he said nothing. The old man nodded, as if he expected that. Come with me. Harris followed him out of the room, relieved to escape the stairs. They walked through the center, past kids playing chess, past a mural of civil rights leaders. They stepped outside into the cold evening air. The old man gestured to the neighborhood around them. Tell me what you see. Harris frowned. What? Look around. What do you see? Harris scanned the street. Old buildings. A liquor store on the corner. A few boarded-up windows. People sitting on front steps, watching the night roll in. He shrugged. A rough neighborhood. The old man sighed. And that's your problem. Harris frowned. Excuse me? The old man gestured again. You see rough. I see families. I see people trying to make a life. I see kids who could do something great if they weren't scared of people like you. Harris felt his jaw tighten. I don't scare kids. The old man turned to him. His voice was quiet but firm. Do you think they feel safe when they see you? Harris opened his mouth, then stopped. Because he didn't know the answer. The old man sighed, rubbing his chin. You want to know the difference between you and me, Harris? I used to wear that badge too. But I never forgot where I came from. Harris swallowed. You're saying I'm the problem. The old man shook his head. No. I'm saying you're blind. But maybe it's not too late to see. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Harris. Harris frowned. What is this? Your assignment. Harris opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Community patrol. No uniform. No badge. Just you and the people. Let's see if you can listen. Harris felt something he hadn't expected. Fear. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was without the badge. And tomorrow, he was going to find out. Officer Harris stood in front of the community center the next morning, without his uniform, without his badge. Just a man in plain clothes. And for the first time in years, he felt exposed. The old man was already waiting for him, leaning on his cane. He gave Harris a long, knowing look. Feels different, doesn't it? Harris exhaled. What exactly are we doing? The old man smirked. Walking. Harris frowned. Walking? That's right. You spend your life driving through these streets, but today, you're gonna walk them. Harris sighed but followed. They walked through the neighborhood, past familiar buildings that suddenly didn't feel so familiar. Without his uniform, people looked at him differently. Some nodded in greeting. Some ignored him completely. Others watched him carefully, uncertain. For the first time, Harris felt something unusual. He wasn't in control. As they passed a small grocery store, a woman outside called out to the old man. Morning, Mr. James. Harris finally had a name for him. Mr. James smiled. Morning, Miss Gloria. How's your grandson? The woman sighed. Trying to keep him on the right path. You know how it is. Mr. James nodded, then glanced at Harris. This here is Officer Harris. He's walking with me today. Harris saw the way the woman's face changed. Not anger. Not fear. Distrust. She crossed her arms. Oh. A cop. Harris forced a small nod. Not today. She raised an eyebrow. You're always a cop. Harris had nothing to say to that. Mr. James stepped in. "We're trying something new. He's here to listen." The woman studied Harris, as if trying to decide whether she believed that. Finally, she exhaled. "You want to listen? Then hear this. My grandson, 15 years old, was walking home last week when your officers stopped him. No reason. Just walking. They made him sit on the curb for 20 minutes while they checked things out." Harris stiffened. The woman's voice shook. "Do you know how it feels to get a call from your child, crying, telling you he's scared, and there's nothing you can do?" Harris had nothing. No excuses. No explanations. Because the truth was, he had done that before. Maybe not to her grandson, but to plenty of young men just like him. The woman shook her head. "You want to know why people don't trust cops? It's not because of what they say. It's because of what they do." Harris felt something shift inside him. He looked around the neighborhood, really looked this time. He saw people, not statistics. Families, not threats. For years, he had patrolled this place, but he had never actually seen it. And that realization hit him harder than anything the judge or Mr. James had said. Maybe he really had been blind all along. Harris sat on a bench outside the community center, staring down at his hands. For years, those hands had gripped a badge, held cuffs, reached for a gun when he felt threatened. But today, they had done nothing. No authority. No power. Just a man listening to the people he had spent his whole career policing. And for the first time, he truly understood why they never trusted him. Mr. James sat beside him, tapping his cane against the ground. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost." Harris exhaled, rubbing his face. "I feel like one." Mr. James chuckled. "Truth'll do that to you." Harris shook his head. "I thought I knew what this job was about." He looked at Mr. James. "I thought I was protecting people." Mr. James nodded slowly. "You were. Just not the people who needed it most." Harris clenched his fists. "So what now? What am I supposed to do with all this?" Mr. James studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "Come with me." Harris followed him inside. The community center was quieter now. Mr. James led him to a small room in the back. Inside, a group of teenagers sat around a table, working on assignments. One of them looked up. "Mr. James, who's this?" "This," Mr. James said, "is Officer Harris. And he's got something to say." Harris stiffened. He stopped. What was he supposed to say? That he was sorry? That he had been wrong? That he hadn't even realized the harm he had caused until today? He swallowed. "I was a cop for a long time," he started slowly. "I thought I understood this city. I thought I understood you. But I didn't." The teenagers watched him carefully, some skeptical, some curious. Harris took a deep breath. "I'm not here as a cop today. I'm here as a man trying to understand. And I want to do better." Silence. Then, the scarred young man from before nodded slightly. "Good. 'Cause talking ain't enough. You gotta show us." Harris nodded. "I will." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. A month had passed since Officer Harris started his community service. At first, it had been nothing more than an assignment, something to get through so he could return to his normal life. But now, everything felt different. He no longer drove through the neighborhood with his windows up, looking for threats. He walked its streets. He no longer saw suspects. He saw people. Mothers trying to keep their kids safe. Fathers working long hours. Young men, just like the ones he used to stop for, looking suspicious, trying to find their way in a world that didn't always give them a chance. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped being a cop trying to fix a mistake, and started being a man trying to make things right. Harris stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the steps. He had been here before, sitting in that courtroom, waiting for his fate. But today, he had come by choice. He climbed the stairs, pushed open the heavy doors, and walked inside. The judge sat behind his desk, flipping through papers. When he looked up and saw Harris, he smiled. "Officer Harris," he said. "Or should I say, just Harris?" Harris smirked. "Still a cop, Your Honor. Just a better one now." The judge nodded, setting his papers aside. "So? What did you learn?" Harris exhaled. "That I was blind." He hesitated. "That power isn't about control. It's about responsibility." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying him. "And what do you plan to do with that lesson?" Harris didn't have to think about it. "Teach it to others." The judge's smile widened. "Then I'd say you finally understand justice." Harris nodded. "Not just justice. People." The judge stood, reaching out a hand. Harris shook it firmly. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a passing of understanding. A silent promise. As Harris walked out of the courthouse, the world outside looked different. Not because it had changed, but because he had.